Let's talk about 2025. It was the year American trade policy got turned completely on its head, a total overhaul that basically redrew the map of global commerce. And believe it or not, the whole story really kicks off with just one single, absolutely staggering number. $2.3 trillion. That is a huge number. What does it even mean? Well, that's the total value of goods, annual imports, that got slapped with new tariffs by May of 2025. And look, this wasn't just some minor tweak to the system. No way. This was a fundamental, ground-shaking change in how the U.S. deals with the global economy. The story of how we got here, it's a wild ride of legal maneuvering and pure economic shock. So let's dive into this new era of tariffs. And we're calling it a new era for a reason. This wasn't just more of the same. The administration's policy in its second term, it completely dwarfed everything that came before. We're talking about a massive, truly historic expansion of tariffs across the board. And this right here, this shows you just how big of a leap we're talking about. Look at that. In the first term, you had about $380 billion worth of goods facing tariffs. Fast forward to 2025, and that number just explodes to 2.3 trillion. That's more than a six-fold increase. So the big question, the elephant in the room, is how on earth was something this massive legally possible without Congress passing a new law? Well, the answer is pretty fascinating. It all came down to a legal strategy that was, let's just say, both incredibly powerful and extremely controversial. They took an old law off the books and used it in a way no one had ever imagined, basically to put these sweeping tariffs in place without needing a green light from Congress. And that tool? It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Now, this law from 1977 was originally meant for things like slapping sanctions on enemy countries during a real national emergency. But here's the twist. The administration declared that the trade deficit itself was a national emergency. And just like that, they claim they have the power to roll out these huge tariffs. As you can imagine, that move set off a firestorm of legal debate almost immediately. Okay, so they had their legal justification, right? But how did they actually decide the tariff rates? Well, at the very core of this whole policy was a specific formula. The argument was pretty simple. Trade deficits are bad, so they came up with something they called a reciprocal tariff, designed to calculate and, well, punish those imbalances. So how did this reciprocal formula actually work? It's kind of straightforward, if a bit unusual. They basically looked at a country's trade deficit with the US, when they sell us more stuff than we sell them. They took that deficit number, divided it by how much they export to us, and then just cut that result in half. Boom, that was your new tariff rate. The official goal? To get those trade imbalances down to zero. But, and this is a big but, economists were not impressed. The formula got hit with a ton of criticism. The consensus was that it was just way too simple, that it didn't really have anything to do with actual trade barriers. I think this quote from The Economist really nails the feeling at the time, calling it almost as random as taxing you on the number of vowels in your name. Ouch. That pretty much tells you how arbitrary it felt to a lot of experts. And this wasn't just some academic debate, This formula had very real, very immediate consequences. It all came to a head on April 2nd, 2025, a day the administration actually called Liberation Day. That's when they unveiled all the specific tariff rates, and it sent an absolute earthquake through the financial markets. Wall Street was terrified of what this seemingly random policy would do. And just look at this timeline. It shows a perfect cause and effect. April 2nd, the tariffs are announced. April 3rd, the very next day, the market tanks. The S&P 500 drops almost 5%, and the Nasdaq has its biggest point loss ever. But then, watch this. On April 9th, the tariffs get suspended. And what happens? The S&P 500 shoots up over 9.5%, its biggest single-day jump since the 2008 crisis. I mean, you can't get a clearer reaction from the market than that. But, this story goes way beyond Wall Street. It was a global event. These reciprocal tariffs didn't just target one or two countries. They hit pretty much every trading partner. And that forced nations all over the world into a mad scramble to figure out, okay, what do we do now? And this table really shows you how wild and varied the impact was. Because the whole thing was based on that one formula, the tariff rates were all over the place. A major partner like the UK gets hit with 10%. The entire EU gets 20%. But then you look at countries like Vietnam, 46%. Or Lesotho getting slapped with a 50% tariff. It was a total mixed bag, depending on your trade numbers. So how did the world react? Well, it was a total scramble. You had a few different approaches. Some countries, like Canada and China, decided to fight fire with fire and came back with their own counter tariffs. Others, like the UK, the EU, and Japan, tried the diplomatic route, hoping to negotiate a better deal. And then a whole bunch of nations started looking for new friends, trying to build new partnerships so they weren't so dependent on the US anymore. All of this was happening while the policy was being legally challenged at the World Trade Organization. It was just chaos, a complete upending of decades of trade policy. But believe it or not, the biggest fight of all was happening right back here in the United States. That move, using the EPA for these massive tariffs, was so unprecedented that it kicked off a huge legal showdown. This wasn't just about trade anymore. It was about the very limits of presidential power. And this fight was destined to go all the way to the top. The second this policy dropped, the lawsuits started flying. The courts got involved, and they started pushing back hard. First, the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled the tariffs were legal. Then it went to a federal appeals court, and they agreed, saying the president had gone too far. After losing in the lower courts like that, it was pretty much inevitable that the Supreme Court would have to step in and hear the case, which ended up being the landmark Learning Resources v. Trump. And that brings us to where we are now. With the Supreme Court's decision on the horizon, this case has become about so much more than tariffs. It's now a fundamental question about the U.S. Constitution, about the balance of power. So the question we're all left with is a big one. How will this decision redraw the lines of power between the president and Congress? Not just for today, but for generations to come.